Grant Voss looked at the badge around my neck, then looked at my wife standing beside him and smiled the way men smile when they're certain the room is watching. "Only people worth 9 million belong here," he said loud enough to carry. "Spouse guest doesn't quite make the cut." Sloane said nothing. She didn't look at me. That silence told me everything the past 9 months had been quietly confirming. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I had been watching Stonewell for 14 months from a position no one in that room knew existed, reading the reports, tracking the numbers, waiting for the moment to be undeniable. Grant thought he was closing a door. He had no idea the person he'd just humiliated had been holding the key to everything he stood on. What do you do when the man who owns the room finally decides to walk in? If this story makes you think about power, about patience, about the people who get overlooked in rooms like that one, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this one, and they're worth your time. The badge was a small thing. A plastic rectangle, a lanyard, 2 words printed in clean sans serif font. Spouse guest. I had looked at it for a moment before putting it on, not because it bothered me, but because I understood exactly what it would do to the people in that room. It would make me invisible in the way that only truly comfortable people ever allow themselves to be. And invisible, I had learned over 14 years of running Holt Equity Trust, is the most useful thing a person can be. I am Derek Holt. On paper, I am an independent risk management consultant. I work from home, I drive a sensible car, and I take a limited number of contracts each year. That is what I tell people when they ask, and most people stop asking after that because there is nothing in the answer that makes them want to know more. That has always suited me fine. The truth that I own 82% of Stonewell Infrastructure Group through a private equity trust has never been something I needed to announce. The people who needed to know it already knew it. Everyone else revealed more about themselves by not knowing it than they ever would have if I had handed them a business card. Stonewell had been on the edge of collapse when I first encountered it. The company had overextended too fast, lost 3 major contracts in succession, and was running out of money to make payroll. What it still had was a solid client base, good field personnel, and infrastructure that would have taken a decade to rebuild from scratch. I was running a small financial consulting firm at the time, and I recognized the pattern immediately. The business wasn't broken, the management was. I provided the capital to stabilize operations, restructure the debt, and keep the workforce intact. In exchange, I took a controlling ownership stake through a trust structure that kept my name off the public-facing documents. Stonewell now employs over 500 people and operates across 6 states. I receive regular reports. I maintain an independent whistleblower channel that routes directly to me, and I retain the right to activate an external audit at any time without advance notice to the executive team. I kept myself invisible because I believed it revealed the truth about the people running the company. When executives think the owner isn't watching you learn everything you need to know about who they actually are. What I had not anticipated was how the same invisibility would slowly become part of what my marriage couldn't survive. Sloane had been at Stonewell for 12 years. She was VP of Strategic Relations, which meant she moved through the kind of rooms I deliberately stayed out of. Investor dinners, leadership conferences, board socials, where people measured each other by their portfolios and their titles. She was good at it. She knew how to read a room and how to make people feel that her attention was worth wanting. I had loved that about her once. Over time, I think she began to see me the way the rest of the world did, a man who worked from home, drove a practical car, and had no visible ambition. She had no reason to think otherwise, because I had never given her one. I knew something was wrong in the marriage long before I had a name for it. There were evenings when Sloane came home from events with an energy that wasn't about the work, a brightness that faded when she looked at me rather than sharpening. I told myself I was reading too much into it. I was good at observing other people's organizations from a distance. I had apparently become very bad at observing my own house. By the time I started to understand what was happening, she had already been involved with Grant Voss for the better part of 9 months. Grant was Stonewell's director of procurement. He had the title, the confidence, and the track record that came from closing deals in front of people who needed to be impressed. Stuart Page, the CEO, considered him essential, a man who brought in business, kept contractors happy, and understood how to move money through a system without anyone looking too closely. What Stuart either didn't know or had decided not to investigate was what Grant was doing with that skill. For at least 30 months, Grant had been running a fraud operation through a company called Blue Quarry Supply, registered under the name of a former business associate. He fabricated competing bids to make Blue Quarry's pricing look competitive, then inflated the invoices after contracts were signed, small adjustments on each line, never large enough to trigger an automatic flag, but consistent and deliberate across dozens of transactions. The money flowed out of Stonewell through a shell consulting firm that had no employees, no office, and no legitimate business activity. A portion of it came back to Grant in the form of a paid apartment, travel, and the lifestyle he maintained alongside his relationship with my wife. Sloan didn't know the money was stolen. I want to be precise about that because it matters. She believed Grant was successful, ambitious, and operating in a world that had room for people like her. What she did do, because Grant had made himself indispensable to her sense of what her life should look like, was give him access to things he wasn't authorized to have: internal meeting schedules, board communication timelines, advance notice of when the internal compliance team would be pulling vendor data. She thought she was confiding in someone she trusted. She didn't understand that Grant had constructed that trust as a tool the same way he had constructed the Blue Quarry invoices, precisely, incrementally, and with the specific purpose of using her position as a shield. There was a woman named Diane Cresswell who had been watching all of this longer than I had. Diane ran field operations for Stonewell 10 years, with the company the kind of institutional knowledge that doesn't show up cleanly on an org chart, but holds a supply chain together at the seams. She had built the equipment distribution system that saved Stonewell roughly $260,000 per year in logistics costs. When that system was presented to the board, the credit went to Grant. Her name was moved to a footnote. She had been nominated for promotion 3 times in 5 years, each time assessed as lacking the capacity to build senior relationships, a phrase that, when you read Diane's actual performance reviews, appeared nowhere in the original evaluations. It appeared in the revisions that Ray Thorne made before the files were finalized. Ray sat on the board's personnel committee and had a long habit of adjusting performance documentation before it entered the official record. Diane had filed multiple anonymous reports through Holt Equity Trust's whistleblower channel over the past 14 months. She documented specific pricing anomalies, flagged the Blue Quarry vendor relationship, and noted the pattern of invoice adjustments. I had read every one of them. I had recognized what they were pointing at, and I had made the decision month after month to wait for a more complete record before activating an external audit, because I did not want to trigger a disruption on the basis of circumstantial evidence that a defense attorney could dismantle in an afternoon. I told myself I was being careful. Looking back, I was being slow, and people paid for my slowness in ways I was not in that room to see. The Summit Capital Dinner was Stonewell's annual event at the Montrose Club, a private venue in Belle Meade where the guest list was curated by net worth and nothing else. Sloan attended as VP. I attended as her husband. The badge they gave me read Spouse Guest, and I kept it on because I had decided before we left the house that I wanted to see how the people running my company behaved toward someone they believed had no standing in the room. What I saw with Grant and Sloan was not subtle. He stood too close to her. He touched the small of her back in the way a man does when he is reminding someone of a claim, not offering comfort. He spoke to her with the specific ease of a person who has already decided the situation is settled. I had suspected for months. That evening, I stopped suspecting and started knowing, and there is a significant difference between those two states, even when the knowledge doesn't change what you have to do next. Grant noticed my badge. He noticed the way other men in that room were noticing it, and he made a calculation, the kind of calculation that feels safe when you believe the other person has nothing, and he walked it across the room and placed it directly in front of me. What I was thinking while he spoke had nothing to do with anger. I was thinking about Diane's reports. I was thinking about the invoice data I had reviewed the previous week. I was thinking about the number of times I had chosen to wait. The humiliation Grant intended was real, but what I felt most clearly in that moment was not anger at him. It was the specific weight of having delayed too long on something I already knew. Sloane didn't say anything to defend me. She asked me quietly not to make it difficult. I understood in that moment that there were two problems I had been slow to address, and they had grown together into something I could no longer separate by waiting. I walked to the hallway and sent one message to Claire Sutton, the attorney who had managed Holt Equity Trust since its founding. The message was brief: activate a full audit. Claire knew what that meant. It meant external auditors with subpoena-level document access. It meant forensic accounting on every Stonewell vendor relationship for the past 3 years. It meant that by morning, nothing at Stonewell would be moving without her team tracking where it went. Before I sent the message, I made one decision I want to be clear about. I told Claire that the personal situation with Sloane was to remain entirely separate from the professional investigation unless there was direct evidence of a compliance violation connected to her role. Any findings about the affair itself would remain private. Any findings about unauthorized data access, conflicts of interest, or interference with personnel files would go into the report like anyone else's. Grant would not be investigated because he was involved with my wife. He would be investigated because he had been running a fraud operation through a company I owned and because a woman who had done her job with integrity was being systematically punished for noticing. That distinction mattered to me then. It still matters. Grant watched me leave the room that evening with the expression of a man who has made a point and is waiting for the other person to absorb it. He did not know he had just confirmed in front of a security camera and a room full of witnesses exactly who he was. He did not know that I had been reading Diane's reports for 14 months, or that I had already reviewed enough of the financial records to know which questions to ask. He did not know that the man he had handed a spouse guest badge was the person who owned 82% of the company he had been stealing from. What he knew was that I had walked out of the room. That was enough for him. It almost always is with men like Grant. They take the exit as confirmation that the exit was forced. They don't consider that some people leave because they've already decided what comes next, and there's no reason to stay. Claire's team moved quietly the way good forensic accountants always do. They didn't announce themselves or request anything through Stonewell's internal channels. They pulled records through the access rights established under the Holt Equity Trust Agreement, vendor contracts, purchase orders, invoice logs, wire transfer histories, and they began building a picture from the numbers outward. Within 72 hours, that picture had a shape I recognized. Within a week, it had a name attached to every transaction. Blue Quarry Supply had received contracts across 30 months covering equipment procurement, materials delivery, and emergency logistics services. On any individual invoice, the price inflation was small enough to read as normal market variance. A few $100s here, a revised freight charge there, a material substitution that cost slightly more than the original specification. The kind of adjustments that get approved by someone who is busy and trusts the person making the recommendation. But when Claire's team laid every Blue Quarry transaction end to end, the total amount drained from Stonewell came to just under $800,000. That was not variance. That was a system. The structural evidence was precise. 2 of the competing bids submitted during Blue Quarry's contract evaluations traced back to a shared mailing address. Several of the original quote documents had been generated on hardware registered to Grant's procurement department. The money Blue Quarry received didn't stay in Blue Quarry. It moved within weeks to a consulting firm registered in a neighboring state, a company with no employees on record, no physical office, and no documented services rendered. From that consulting firm, payments flowed to a furnished apartment lease, to travel bookings, and to expenses that corresponded with uncomfortable precision to the timeline of Grant's relationship with Sloane. Grant understood that something was moving before he could see exactly what. He was experienced enough with financial systems to recognize when data was being extracted in patterns that didn't match normal internal operations. Whatever he suspected, he didn't hesitate. Within days of the audit beginning, he went to Stuart Page with a version of events that was carefully constructed and just plausible enough to hold. His account, as Stuart later relayed it to the board, was straightforward. Derek Holt, the husband of Stonewell's VP of Strategic Relations, was conducting what amounted to an unauthorized investigation of company records because he suspected his wife of having an affair with a senior employee. The audit was not a compliance action, it was a domestic dispute wearing the clothes of corporate governance. Stuart accepted this framing with what I can only describe as relief, because a jealous husband was a problem he knew how to manage, and a procurement fraud approaching $800,000 was not. He issued a directive that Derek Holt was not to enter Stonewell's offices without prior authorization from Sloan, and he sent a formal objection to Claire's firm questioning the legal basis of the document access. Sloan, for her part, sided with the version of events that kept her career intact. She called me the evening after Stuart's directive went out. The conversation was brief and controlled on her end, the way conversations are when someone has already decided what they're going to say before they dial. She told me I had humiliated her, that I had gone into the Summit Capitol dinner and then turned my embarrassment into a weapon against her when the room noticed. She said the audit was transparent, that everyone at Stonewell understood what I was doing and why, and that I was burning down her professional life because I couldn't tolerate the idea that she had built something without me. I listened to all of it. I didn't argue because arguing would have required me to explain things I wasn't ready to explain, and because some of what she said wasn't wrong, even if the conclusions she drew from it were. The situation changed the morning Claire called me about Diane Cresswell. Grant had spent the same period Claire's team was pulling records doing something methodical of his own. He had gone through the audit requests carefully enough to identify which data had been flagged, and he had worked backward from that to the most likely source of the original whistleblower reports. Diane's name wasn't on those reports she had filed anonymously, as the channel was designed to allow, but Grant knew his own department's anomalies well enough to know who had been paying attention to them. He made his decision with the same precision he'd applied to the invoice inflation incremental deniable and designed to be discovered only after it was too late. Using his administrative credentials, Grant created a secondary user account linked to Diane's login profile. That account was used to access and download a set of vendor files during hours when Diane was documented as off-site. He then placed a hard drive containing restricted contract documents inside a storage cabinet in Diane's section of the operations floor. 2 days later, he formally escalated a request for Diane to account for discrepancies in Stonewell's procurement data, a scope of inquiry she had never had the authority to approve or deny, and framed the escalation as a performance matter requiring immediate executive review. Stuart acted on what was in front of him. Diane was suspended pending investigation. The board received a recommendation to forward her file to the State Attorney General's office with a preliminary finding of data theft and contract interference. The woman who had spent over a year carefully documenting a real fraud was about to be prosecuted for the fraud that had been constructed around her. I want to say something clearly here because it is the part of this story I find most difficult to recount. Diane had done everything right. She had used the legitimate channel. She had documented specific, verifiable anomalies. She had filed reports with enough detail that a competent reviewer, which I was, should have moved faster. Instead, I had spent months deciding that the record wasn't complete enough, that the disruption wasn't worth the uncertainty. And in the time I spent being patient, Grant had built a case against the one person who had tried to make me move. That is the part of this story where I stopped thinking about Stonewell as an institution I was protecting and started thinking about it as a system I had allowed to run long enough to hurt someone who trusted it. Claire called me the same afternoon Diane's suspension was formalized. Her team had recovered a set of deleted messages from a Stonewell-issued device, communications that had been wiped but not fully overwritten. The messages confirmed the relationship between Grant and Sloan across 9 months. They also showed specific exchanges, Sloan sending Grant the closed session schedule for an upcoming board meeting, Sloan forwarding an internal memo related to a vendor compliance review, Sloan noting in a message sent the evening before a scheduled audit pull that the internal team was planning to request data the following morning. There was a thread in which Grant described Diane as a persistent operational liability, and Sloan's responses in that thread included language that appeared nearly verbatim in a formal performance note that later blocked one of Diane's promotion evaluations. Claire asked me how I wanted to handle the material related to Sloan. I told her to handle it the same way she would handle any other employee. The messages that showed professional misconduct, the data transfers, the advance notice, the personnel interference would go into the report with everyone else's documentation. The personal content that had no bearing on Diane's situation or the financial fraud would remain out of the record. I was not going to use a confidential audit to expose my marriage, but I was not going to protect Sloan's career at the cost of Diane's freedom. That evening, Sloan came home with a different kind of energy than the controlled anger of the phone call. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, and what I saw in her face was not defiance anymore. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been holding a story together for too long and knows it is beginning to come apart. She told me the truth, or most of it. She confirmed that what had been developing between her and Grant had started approximately 9 months earlier. She told me she had moved $18,000 into a separate account that she had been planning to ask for a divorce after Grant secured a more senior position at Stonewell. She told me she had felt invisible in our marriage, that I had built walls around myself so thoroughly that she had stopped being able to locate me inside our own home. She wasn't wrong about the walls. I had spent 14 years believing that invisible ownership was a form of integrity, and I had applied the same logic to my marriage without ever asking whether Sloan had consented to living inside that framework. I told her that. I acknowledged that hiding as much as I had hidden for as long as I had hidden it was a genuine failure, not a tactical decision that happened to inconvenience her, but a real failure to treat her as someone who deserved to know who she had married. But I also told her that my failure and her choices were two separate things, and that one did not cancel the other. I had made our marriage smaller than it should have been. She had used her position to help a man who was stealing from a company she didn't know I owned. Those two facts could both be true at the same time, and neither one excused the other. She asked me to stop the audit, or at minimum, remove her name from the formal record. I told her I would not publicize anything personal to damage her, but I would not remove evidence of a compliance violation from a compliance investigation. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she told me she needed to speak with someone about how to handle the next few days, and she left the room. Whatever Grant said to her in the conversation that followed the result was a signed statement prepared by Stewart's legal team affirming that the external audit had been initiated for personal reasons, that Grant had no financial relationship with any Stonewell vendor, that Diane had demonstrated a pattern of hostility toward management, and that all documentation used in Diane's suspension review had been obtained through legitimate internal processes. Stewart called an emergency board session for the following morning. The agenda had 3 items: Diane's termination, a referral to law enforcement, and a motion to invalidate the external audit on the grounds that it had been initiated outside authorized ownership channels. I spent that night reading Claire's full preliminary report. Every number confirmed, every deleted message recovered, every timestamp on every access log showing Grant's administrative credentials opening files they had no reason to touch. When I was finished, I knew I had something that Grant and Stewart did not. A record that didn't need me to explain it. It only needed to be read. What I didn't have yet was the room to read it in. I arrived at Stonewell's offices at 7:45 the following morning, 45 minutes before the board session was scheduled to begin. The security guard at the front desk recognized me. He had seen me twice before in 12 years, which tells you something about how consistently I had stayed out of the building, and he checked his screen with the careful expression of someone who already knows the answer isn't going to be simple. Stewart's access restriction was in the system. The guard made a call upstairs, then he asked me to wait in the lobby. Stewart came down with Grant. Two members of Stonewell's legal department walked a step behind them carrying folders. Sloan was there as well, standing beside Grant in the way that made the alignment unmistakable to anyone in the lobby who cared to read it. I looked at her for a moment. She held my eyes, then looked away, not with guilt exactly, but with the resolve of someone who has already made their decision and is now simply enduring the moment of its visibility. Stewart spoke first. He told me the board meeting was an internal proceeding, that my presence had not been requested, and that the access restriction he had issued remained in effect. He said it with the measured authority of a man who has spent 30 years believing that composure is the same thing as control. Grant stood beside him and said nothing, which was its own kind of statement, the confidence of someone who believes the outcome is already written. I told them I had a few questions before I left and that I needed them answered on the record. I asked Stewart's assistant, who had followed the group down and was standing near the reception desk with a notepad, to document the exchange. Then I asked Stewart and Grant to confirm 5 things: whether Diane Cresswell had been investigated through a fair and impartial process, whether all evidence used in her suspension review was authentic and unaltered, whether Grant held any financial interest in Blue Quarry Supply or any entity connected to it, whether Sloan Holt had provided Grant with any confidential Stonewell data, and whether I, Derek Holt, held any ownership stake or controlling interest in Stonewell Infrastructure Group. Grant confirmed the first 4 without hesitation. Stewart confirmed all 5. His answer on the 5th question was clear, direct, and entered into the notes being taken beside the reception desk. Sloan did not withdraw the signed statement she had submitted the previous evening. I looked at Grant then, at the ease in his posture, the slight forward angle of a man who believes he has just watched his opponent's final move fail. He had the expression of someone waiting for me to leave. I reached into my jacket and set the Holt Equity Trust authorization document on the reception desk. I said the person who owns 82% of Stonewell is the one who invited me. Claire Sutton came through the front doors 40 seconds later. She was followed by the external audit team, an independent legal counsel retained by the trust, and a financial crimes investigator from the state of Tennessee. The board meeting that had been convened to terminate Diane Cresswell and invalidate the audit became, within the hour, a formal evidentiary proceeding. Claire began with the ownership documentation. She established without ambiguity and with full chain of title records that Holt Equity Trust held 82% of Stonewell Infrastructure Group and that the trust instrument granted explicit authority to initiate external audits without advance notice to Stonewell's executive leadership. Every public statement Stewart and Grant had made about the audit's legitimacy, including the confirmations recorded 20 minutes earlier in the lobby, was entered into the proceeding record. The fraud findings came next, presented in the order the evidence had been assembled. The fabricated competing bids and their shared mailing address, the Blue Quarry contract history and the invoice inflation pattern across 30 months, the wire transfers to the Shell consulting firm and the outflow from that firm to Grant's personal expenses. The final confirmed figure was $783,400. Claire presented it without emphasis, the way you present a number when the number is already its own argument. Grant's attorney attempted to characterize the financial analysis as selectively assembled by a party with a personal grievance. Claire responded by walking the board through the methodology, every data source, every access log, every transaction record, and the name of the independent forensic accounting firm that had reviewed her team's conclusions the previous evening and found no material errors. The methodology didn't need defending, it needed reading. The evidence against Diane came apart the same way it had been built, piece by piece, but in reverse. The system log showed that the secondary account used to download restricted vendor files had been created using administrative credentials belonging to Grant's access tier, not Diane's. The building entry records showed Diane had badged out of the building 3 hours before the file downloads occurred and had not returned until the following morning. The hallway camera footage showed Grant entering the operations storage area where Diane worked 2 days before the hard drive was found. Diane's personnel file confirmed she had never held procurement approval authority at any point in her 10 years with the company, which made the allegation that she had manipulated vendor contracts structurally incoherent on its face. Each piece of evidence that had been used to build a case against her pointed, when examined in sequence, directly back to the person who had constructed it. Stewart's position was addressed separately. Claire presented the 2 documented internal warnings Stewart had received regarding Blue Quarry's pricing anomalies, one from a compliance officer 14 months earlier, one from a department head 8 months ago, along with the contracts he had approved in the weeks following each warning. She did not characterize his choices, she presented the sequence and allowed the board to read it. Stewart had not taken Blue Quarry's money, but he had known enough to ask a question he had consistently chosen not to ask, and then had used his authority to obstruct an investigation that was asking it in his place. The personnel records came last. Ray Thorne had submitted his resignation by email that morning, timed to land before the session began. The board reviewed documentation showing 3 separate instances in which Diane's promotion evaluations had been altered between their submission by her direct supervisors and their entry into the official HR record. Positive assessments of Diane's operational judgment and team leadership had been replaced with language about communication gaps and insufficient executive presence. Nora Hayfield's file showed a similar pattern across 2 separate review cycles. Grant made his final argument personally, setting aside his attorney to address the board directly. He said the entire proceeding had been constructed by a man whose wife had been having an affair with him, and that every piece of evidence in the room had been selected and framed by people working for that man. I asked to respond. I told the board that if my intention had been to punish Grant for his relationship with my wife, I had the authority to terminate his employment the moment I learned of it. I had not done so. Instead, I had commissioned an independent forensic review, submitted the findings to an outside accounting firm for verification, and brought a state financial crimes investigator into the room before taking any action against anyone's employment. I then told the board something I had not said publicly before, that I had received Diane Cresswell's first whistleblower report 14 months ago, and that I had delayed activating the audit because I wanted a more complete record before disrupting the company. That delay had given Grant additional time to move money and to build a false case against the person who had reported him. I was not in that room because I had handled this well. I was in that room because I had finally stopped handling it slowly. Stewart asked whether the board would consider an internal resolution to limit reputational exposure. I told him that protecting the company's relationships was the reason the proceeding had to be public. Stonewell's clients and contractors had spent 30 months paying prices that included a hidden surcharge routed to Grant's personal expenses. An internal settlement would protect the people who had run the system, not the people who had been harmed by it. The outcomes were not dramatic in the way that outcomes in rooms like that sometimes are. Grant was escorted from the building by the state investigator, pending a formal financial crimes inquiry. Stewart was removed from the CEO position by board vote. Before the session closed, the vote was not close. Diane's suspension was lifted the same afternoon. Her personnel file was corrected to reflect the original, unaltered evaluations her supervisors had actually submitted, and the board issued a formal acknowledgement that the equipment distribution system she had developed was her work. The bonus and compensation adjustments withheld across 3 promotion cycles were restored. Nora Hayfield's file was reviewed and corrected in a parallel process, and she was offered the director-level contract management position the altered evaluations had kept her from reaching. Sloane's situation was handled as I had said it would be. The investigation found no evidence that she had known the money was stolen. What it found was that she had shared confidential board schedules, forwarded an internal vendor review memo, provided advance warning of compliance data requests, and contributed language to a personnel evaluation at Grant's request, all without disclosing the relationship that made each of those actions a conflict of interest. She resigned before the board moved to a termination vote and agreed to cooperate fully with the ongoing investigation into Grant. I did not use ownership authority to strip her of what she was legally entitled to from our marriage. I also did not use it to protect her from what her own actions had produced. We filed for divorce in the weeks that followed. The conversation where we agreed to it was not angry. She told me she understood now why I had kept so much hidden for so long, and that understanding it didn't make it easier to have lived inside it. I told her the same was true of what I now understood about her. There are marriages that end because two people become strangers, and there are marriages that end because two people finally see each other clearly and recognize that what they're looking at cannot hold. Ours was the second kind. That does not make it a small thing. 8 weeks after the board session, a search committee completed a transparent external selection process for Stonewell's new chief executive. Diane Cresswell was appointed. The committee's report cited her operational track record, her management discipline, and a decade of demonstrated integrity under conditions specifically designed to discourage it. The first thing Diane did in her new role was cancel the Summit Capital dinner. In its place, she established the Stonewell Builders Table, an annual recognition event open to every employee who had contributed something specific and documented to the company's operations in the preceding year. No net worth threshold, no tiered guest list. Warehouse staff, field engineers, drivers, project managers, and board members occupied the same room under the same terms. The invitations went out with one criterion: you did something that made this company work, and we can name exactly what it was. I attended the first one. My badge said guest, nothing else. In my jacket pocket, I still carried the badge from the Summit Capital dinner, the one that said spouse guest, the one Grant had pointed to when he decided I wasn't worth the room. I had kept it because it was a reminder, not a trophy. A reminder that I had been invisible in that building for 14 years and that people had been hurt during the time I spent telling myself that patience was the same thing as wisdom. Diane had filed 14 months of reports into a channel I controlled. I had read every one of them and chosen to wait. That is not the action of a man who handled things well. It is the action of a man who finally did the right thing after waiting long enough that it cost someone else something real. Grant had pointed at that badge to tell me I didn't belong. He looked at what was visible, the badge, the practical car, the husband standing one step behind his wife, and concluded that visible was the same as total. That was his mistake. Power doesn't justify itself by existing. It only tells you what kind of person you are by how you use it, and whether you use it before someone else pays the price for your hesitation. The builder's table filled the same room where Grant had made his announcement about $9 million minimums. The noise in it was different, louder, less careful, more actual. Diane moved through it the way she moved through everything, directly, without ceremony, paying attention to the people doing the work rather than the people narrating it. I watched her from across the room and thought about what it means to do the right thing in a system that is actively trying to stop you with no guarantee that anyone is listening. Someone was listening. I was just too slow to say so. If any part of this story stayed with you, the idea that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the one with the most to say, or that doing the right thing under pressure is its own kind of power, then this channel is worth your time. We tell stories about people who chose the harder path when the easier one was right there in front of them. If that means something to you, subscribe. Every story here is built on the same belief that integrity, even when no one is watching, is never wasted.